History as it happens, January 26, 2021, the first 1,000 days.
This nation is asking for action, and action now.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
The crisis of deep human suffering is in plain sight, and there's no time to waste. We have to act, and we have to act now.
FDR mobilized the government to confront the Depression. Reagan called for the government to get out of the way. President Biden has his own ambitious plans to save a country whose leaders remain split over the role of Washington in solving our ills. As we report History as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
This is no unsolvable problem if we face it wisely and courageously. It can be accomplished in part by direct recruiting by the government itself.
It is no coincidence that our present troubles parallel and are proportionate to the intervention and intrusion in our lives that result from unnecessary and excessive growth of government.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first 1,000 days of the Biden administration. Our problem seems so large it'll take more than 100 days to fix things, but President Biden is taking an FDR-like intensity to his new job. He signed a slew of executive orders, and he's pushing big pieces of legislation to help Americans survive the pandemic. You know, the notion the federal government should intervene in the free market and directly aid the poor is relatively new in America. Came to fruition in FDR's New Deal. The Reagan Revolution sought to turn it back. Joe Biden sounds like he wants to revive that New Deal spirit, meaning the government has a role to play in upholding the social contract.
No one working 40 hours a week should live below the poverty line. That's what it means. If you work for less than $15 an hour and work 40 hours a week, you're living in poverty.
If you believe the pandemic exposed long-running problems with American capitalism, you might like some of Biden's ideas, which include, as you just heard, a national $15 minimum wage. The president's legislative agenda raises an old question. From FDR to Reagan, what is the proper role of government? Before we look at that history, let's talk about what's about to happen. Washington Times White House reporter Seth McLaughlin is here now to discuss what we can expect as Congress sets to work. All right, Seth, first, let's congratulate you on your promotion to covering the Biden White House.
Thank you very much, Martin. It should be a roller coaster ride?
Yes, hopefully less intense than the last one. But let's dive in right now. Priority one, the $1.9 trillion pandemic relief plan. It's not going to sail through, huh?
Yeah, we're kind of falling back into more traditional battle lines in a way. This is obviously going to come down to spending, what the final price tag is. You know, some of the other things in there, we got a $15 minimum wage, paid sick leave. You know, there's some other goodies for the far left of the party that might not sit well with the more conservative / Trump elements of the Republican Party. But more so, I think it's the broader price tag, which could scare away some Republicans.
Well, that means it'll be Joe Biden's first test of his pledge to make bipartisan deals, right?
He was elected, you know, under the promise that he basically is an institutionalist after serving 36 years in the Senate, and that he was able to carve out friendships with members across the aisle, some who are still there, and that will work to his benefit to actually pass legislation on Capitol Hill.
As opposed to the easier work of signing executive orders. And we have to mention, Seth, by the time our listeners are tuning into this podcast, we should know whether Donald Trump's impeachment trial will happen now or in February. What's your sense of when the Biden team wants that to happen?
I think they've been pretty open about the idea that they think the Senate can balance impeachment with carrying out their day-to-day duties. So, you know, it seems like that's the avenue and the way they're going to go now. Now, the question is whether or not an impeachment trial really becomes a poison pill for any sort of negotiations when it comes to the coronavirus package. There are these quote unquote honeymoon periods we like to talk about with new administrations. And because of the coronavirus, and also because of the storming of the Capitol, there does seem to be some middle ground to be had right now when it comes to legislation. But does that impeachment trial again suck all the oxygen out of the room and harden people's more partisan stances?
It's hard to know how long an impeachment trial may go on.
again, it's like, how long does the goodwill last, right?
Possibly not very long, and that's important because beyond the immediate pandemic relief package, Joe Biden is proposing ideas to address long-running structural problems in American capitalism or long-neglected areas like infrastructure. So when might we see those bills calling for government intervention in different areas?
It's a good question. I mean, the first thing we saw the administration drop was not only this coronavirus package, but also an immigration bill. The Biden administration putting down a marker in negotiations over where they want to go with that, but it basically doesn't include any of the typical or traditional border security elements that Republicans would ask for as a way to balance out, say, a path to citizenship that Democrats continually want. Infrastructure, of course, it just seems like every 4 years people are like, oh, infrastructure is the magic pill that, you know, both sides will rally around. And this is going to be the thing, not only that will get, say, Republicans on board in spending money, but also excites Democrats because they believe it will be a big job builder, right? And beyond that, I mean, there are obviously a major bridge and road projects that do need to be fixed, built,
ports,
strengthened.
tunnels, rail lines. Last I checked, both Republicans and Democrats and people who don't care about politics use all those things.
That's totally true, because I have not seen an off-ramp at a tunnel, you know, before a tunnel for a Democrat or Republican.
Democrats only.
Yes, exactly.
Let's wrap it up with this, Seth. Every new president has his first 100 days, which has taken on a mythological importance since FDR. The first 100 days are overrated, I think, but this year, it seems these first few months will be critical for the Biden presidency and at least some of his legislative agenda, given everything that's happening.
I'll go a little broader on this whole thing, Martin, and say Joe Biden was not necessarily elected with a massive legislative mandate.
That's
right?
true.
He was elected, I think, as an anecdote in a lot of ways to President Trump, more Trump's style, his unconventional presidency, and his abrasive approach to politics. And so I think the challenge for Joe Biden is, like in his inaugural speech, he preached unity, right? But I don't think we heard any legislative proposals there.
No, there are very few specifics.
Right. And so the question is, once we get into the real legislation, like we move beyond the personality of the White House and the things that drove a lot of people crazy about Trump, and get into, again, the details of legislation, what happens then?
Well, I'll pass on predicting the future. Washington Times White House reporter Seth McLaughlin. Thanks for chatting and enjoy the ride this week. You know, it's been said a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. Depending on your political philosophy, this crisis right now is an opportunity to redefine the terms of economic life in America. Or maybe you believe the government really needs to use a lighter touch. Historian Lee Edwards is a distinguished fellow in conservative thought at the Heritage Foundation. He joins us now to talk about these opposing views on the role of government in a capitalist society. Lee, great to have you here. A Pew Research poll late last year found that only 20% of Americans say they trust the government in Washington to do the right thing just about always or most of the time. But majorities, more so for Democrats than Republicans, want the government to play a major role in solving problems, such as alleviating poverty. So do you believe Americans are ready now for some bold or sweeping government action?
Well, I think what we have is a divided government, which is reflective of our divided country. The issue, I think you're absolutely right, in my mind, is how much government do we want? How much government do we need? And by the way, this is an argument which has been going on since the founding. So we've been going at this for 240 years, Martin, and here we are. And I think one of the reasons why it has become an issue now, and I agree with you, it has, is because of not only the pandemic, but the fact that the impact that it's had on the government. And this compounds a lot of the faith that Americans have lost in their government because of the Great Recession. So I think we are engaged in a great debate over this issue.
So let's listen to part of Ronald Reagan's 1981 inaugural address. He mentions the word government 17 times in the speech, usually in a negative sense. I'd like your take, Lee, on whether his words 40 years ago still match our current mood.
We are a nation that has a government, not the other way around. and this makes us special among the nations of the earth. Our government has no power except that granted it by the people. It is time to check and reverse the growth of government, which shows signs of having grown beyond the consent of the governed.
Before you respond, context is, of course, critical. Coming out of the late 1970s, Reagan had a receptive audience for trying something new. But do you agree now that distrust of government seems to be an impediment to solving our problems?
Well, his philosophy was based upon the idea of liberty and the fact that there's no such thing as a free lunch, to quote Milton Friedman, that if you're going to have more government, you're going to have more taxes, you're going to have less money in the pockets of the people. And Reagan was dead flat against that, both as governor of California and as president. And he was the first president to come along since FDR, whom you mentioned, to challenge directly this idea that when we have a problem, let's turn to government. It was, in fact, FDR who in 1932 and 1933, both in a campaign speech and then in an inaugural, in which he said that government has a responsibility to care for the welfare of its citizens.
Right on cue, Lee.
Our greatest primary task is to put people to work. This is no unsolvable problem if we face it wisely and courageously. It can be accomplished in part by direct recruiting by the government itself.
No president ever used that language before of saying that government has a responsibility to care for the welfare of its citizens. And that became more or less accepted and acceptable for the next several decades. And along came Mr. Reagan, who said that in this crisis, government is not the solution, government is the problem. Now, what's important to keep in mind is that he said, in this crisis. And what he meant by that was that we need government, particularly in times of crisis, but it has to be controlled.
I think this is what you're referring to.
Now, so there will be no misunderstanding, it's not my intention to do away with government. It is rather to make it work with us, not over us, to stand by our side, not ride on our back.
It was a wonderful phrase which he and other conservatives have used, and that is ordered liberty. That idea of ordered liberty is at the root of Ronald Reagan's philosophy, and I think it's going to be at the root of what conservatives are going to be debating with liberals and progressives led by Mr. Biden, President Biden, in the years ahead.
Well, good segue there. Let's talk about President Biden and what he has in mind. On January 14th, the week before taking the oath of office, he called for what I consider a new deal of sorts. Those are my words, not his, where the government, after tackling the virus, will still have a role to play in taking care of long-running problems. I want to play you a clip from his speech. It runs about a minute, and then get your thoughts on it.
We'll use taxpayers' dollars to rebuild America. We'll buy American products, supporting millions of American manufacturing jobs, enhancing our competitive strength in an increasingly competitive world. Imagine historic investments in research and development to sharpen America's innovative edge in markets where global leadership is up for grabs. Markets like the battery technology, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, clean energy. Imagine confronting the climate crisis with American jobs and ingenuity leading the world. It's time to stop talking about infrastructure and to finally start building an infrastructure.
Well, of course, it is a shopping list, and if you asked any progressive what needs to be done, they would come up, I think, with a very similar laundry list. So I think that what Mr. Biden was doing there was reflecting the philosophy, the ideology, if you will, of the Democratic Party. But there are so many. We have to keep in mind that some 73 million, I think it was, 73 million people voted for Donald Trump. And if they voted for him, they had some idea of his conservative/populist philosophy, which is, that government is best, which governs least, taken right out of Jefferson. And so here we are again. That may be his laundry list, but he is going to have, I think, a real challenge getting all of that through a Congress in which the margins are so narrow for democratic philosophy, for the progressive philosophy.
One area where I can't understand why there isn't a bipartisan stampede to get something done is infrastructure. That would seem to be a place where the federal government has the primary role to get things done.
Well, yes, and I think the precedent there was set by Dwight David Eisenhower with the interstate highway system. You know, people got tired of spending days on getting their kicks on Route 66. They said there must be an easier way to get from the Midwest to the Far West. And so Mr. Eisenhower, basically a conservative, said, well, let's set up the interstate highway system, which he did. So I think in answer to your question of why there hasn't been more action taken on that, is that people got, I won't say distracted, but got pulled into a different direction because of the pandemic.
I hope you're enjoying this conversation with the Heritage Foundation historian Lee Edwards. You know, Lee, there's always the chance that if the economy recovers really quickly, it would pull the rug out from under efforts to legislate, let's say, more intrusively into the economy. In his 1937 number 2 inaugural address, Roosevelt said, even in normal times, he saw 1/3 of a nation ill-housed, ill-clad, ill-nourished. And he warned Americans not to let what was then a significant, if incomplete, recovery from the Depression fool them into believing they had no more work to do. Let's listen to that.
To hold to progress today is more difficult. Dull conscience, irresponsibility, ruthless self-interest already reappear. Such symptoms of prosperity may become the portents of disaster.
Allow me to repeat what Roosevelt said there because it was a little grainy. Such symptoms of prosperity may become portents of disaster. And he went on to say prosperity already tests the persistence of our progressive purpose. In other words, Roosevelt was worried that the crisis might go to waste.
What would happen if he was able to bring his dreams into reality? I think they'd be a disaster. And in contra to his argument, I would suggest you can look at what Ronald Reagan did with his tax cut recovery program, that he sparked an unprecedented period of economic prosperity lasting well into the next decade because of that. And at the heart of that was both tax cuts and deregulation to allow this great, mighty machine that we have a free enterprise in this country to operate. And here we get, I think, an important point I'd like to stress, and that is what we have here with that eloquent statement by Mr. Roosevelt is the fatal conceit of the liberal/progressive that the government, that a bureaucracy knows better how to run our lives than we do ourselves. And that is something that would be totally rejected and I think proven false by both the presidencies of Ronald Reagan and also by Donald Trump.
Historian Lee Edwards, thank you for sharing your insights here today. Scholars disagree on whether Reaganomics worked as well as its adherents continue to claim. In his 2008 history, The Age of Reagan, Princeton's Sean Willent says Reagan's fiscal policy succeeded mainly in raising deficits to astronomical levels, while further enriching the already affluent. Willent notes the unemployment rate did not fall to the level of 1979 until 1988, Reagan's last year in office. These aren't merely academic debates. American politicians make claims on the past to support their present positions. And that's something we'll watch for closely as Democrats and Republicans debate the best way to get the country back on its feet during the current crisis. A crisis too terrible to waste. On the next episode of History as It Happens, King and Vietnam. The Mlk Holiday came and went with the usual remembrances of the slain civil rights hero. The holiday was overshadowed some by the political dramas playing out in Washington. So let's try to recover some forgotten parts of King's legacy. His anti-militarism, his critiques of capitalism, intertwined with the struggle for civil rights at home. As we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.